Noon heat pressed down on Willow Bend when Thathanka Luta reined his sorrel and saw the schoolteacher locked in the stocks, wrists scraped raw against gray wood, scalp burned white where a bonnet had been torn away, and above her someone had carved with a knife Indian's wife, so deep the letters still wept sap. The square smelled of lye, horse, and dust. The bell rope hung still. A crow walked the rail and pecked a fly from her cheek until she flinched without strength to lift her head. He slid from the saddle, unstoppered his canteen, tipped water to her cracked lips, and watched breath come easier like wind returning to a dead stove. She was Miss Alder, the one who taught small hands their letters and had once tried to learn his words with care when peace was written in ink. When he asked inside his chest who did this, she breathed sheriff first, then Pastor Hobb, before pain took the rest. Luta set his palm to the beam, feeling the heat and the knife strokes, each cut a dare. He touched the pouch at his neck where tiny beaded moccasins lay blue and white with a red path, the promise that steadied his breath. He studied the wedge pin that held the stocks. It was chewed with rust and would turn if he bought a handful of seconds. He said we go soon, though he owned no plan big enough for the words, and he slid one hand under the board so her weight would not grind the raw skin while his other worried the pin. Boot heels scraped across the porch. A shadow cooled the dust. Crowley of the ranch guard halted with a baton of whittled pine and said the noon mark is near, and the law keeps time, so step aside and let the chastening stand. Luta did not step and answered that the lesson belongs to those who carved the beam, not to the one tied to it. Crowley's grin showed the gold tooth Vane had bought him. The deputy rose. 2 riders edged into the square and laid a coil of rope across a wagon seat. Somewhere kerosene stung the air. From the livery loft a mirror winked. From the south road a rider lifted a hand. The deputy unfolded paper with clumsy ceremony and said, "The warrant will be read at noon, and the body delivered after." Luta tasted iron and touched the moccasins again, the smallness of them a weight that could tip a life, and he knew he would break this wood even if the cost was every mile ahead of him. He bent his shoulder to the board. The pin grudged another notch. Miss Alder whispered, "Not my choice," and he said, "Then we make it ours." Smoke licked the far end of the street. Shutters cracked open like teeth while boys ran and vanished. A hawk wheeled above the steeple with sun caught in its wings, and the sorrel stamped at the scent of smoke, ears flicking toward the south road where horses shifted in shadow. Miss Alder's pulse beat against his fingers. The carved words above her breathed heat back into his face like a furnace door. Crowley stepped closer, baton raised now like a hymn book turned cudgel, and he smiled as the bell rope stirred without wind. The deputy began to read the words that would sell a woman as a lesson to a town. Voice flat as tin, and Luta understood the next heartbeat would decide whether the square learned mercy or learned blood. The first crack of the deputy's voice was drowned by the hawk's scream overhead, a sound that dropped every gaze skyward for a breath, and in that breath Luta's fingers drove the wedge pin free. The stocks loosened with a low groan, but Miss Alder's arms trembled too hard to pull free, and before he could lift the board, Crowley's baton slammed across Luta's ribs. He took the hit without falling, swung his shoulder to block the next, and pushed the stock beam high enough for her to duck. She staggered forward, knees buckling, catching herself on his arm. The crowd rippled like grass in wind, murmurs thick with disbelief. From the shadowed edge of the mercantile porch came a sound Luta had not expected. A child's thin cry. His eyes cut toward it, and there, half hidden in the dark between sacks of grain, a small figure peered out, hair pale, skin sun-brown, tiny feet wrapped in the beaded moccasins from his pouch. He knew then what the teacher had meant by "not my choice." The girl's eyes locked on his, wide and steady despite the fear in the square, and he saw the same curve of cheek as in a face he had loved once. Crowley turned, saw the child, and something in his grin curdled. He barked for the riders to bring her, voice harsh as iron on ice. Miss Alder moved to shield the girl, but her body swayed too weakly. Luta stepped into the gap, his frame blocking the aisle between the crowd and the porch. The deputy's paper fluttered in the wind, the words unread, forgotten. Rope coils slid from saddles, and a rider leaned to snatch the child. The hawk screamed again, lower now, almost in warning. Luta's hand went to his belt knife, not for the blade, but for the weight of decision. 100 eyes were on him, but his mind counted only 2 heartbeats, the one against his ribs from the woman still leaning there, and the faster one he imagined in the tiny chest under the moccasins. Miss Alder whispered something that might have been her name, but the cry of the crowd drowned it. The rope in the rider's hand swung close, and Luta caught it, yanked him sideways from the saddle so hard his boot caught in the stirrup. The horse lurched, dragging the man in a stumbling arc that knocked over 2 others and opened a space in the line. Luta shoved the teacher toward it, the girl darting from the porch like a deer after her mother, though she reached for him even as she ran. Behind them, Crowley roared orders, the square turning to chaos, men pushing through with rifles, women pulling children back into doorways. The hawk wheeled once more, then dove low, scattering dust into eyes, and in that moment Luta grabbed both child and woman, lifting them onto the sorrel with a fluid motion that came from years of battle and escape. He swung up behind, heels to the horses' flanks, driving them toward the south road. The sorrel's hooves pounded against packed earth, each stride carrying them farther from the square, but deeper into the hills where lawless hands reached farther than the sheriff's badge. The girl clung to Miss Alder's waist, head buried, while the teacher's gaze never left the carved words still burning in her mind. Luta glanced back once, saw the smoke still rising from somewhere beyond town, and knew the road ahead would offer no safety. Only the chance to keep moving until he could understand what debt had been laid at his feet. The sorrel's breath came in sharp bursts as it climbed the narrow trail toward the low ridge where juniper clung to rock like fingers. Wind carried the smell of mesquite smoke from the town they'd left, mixed with the faint copper of blood from the cut on Miss Alder's wrist. She held the child close, tucking the beaded moccasins beneath her skirt as if hiding a secret no one else could touch. Luta kept one hand on the reins, the other resting near the knife at his belt, listening for the hollow echo of pursuit in the gulch below. The girl's small head turned toward him once, eyes measuring him in a way that didn't belong to her years, and he saw her mother's stubbornness there. Behind them, a hawk drifted on the thermals, its shadow skating over rock and brush, keeping pace as if tethered to their flight. A gunshot cracked from far off, not aimed but a signal, and the sorrel twitched its ears. Luta urged it higher, taking a cut in the trail that wound behind a boulder shaped like a buffalo's head. They stopped just long enough for him to slide from the saddle and press his ear to the ground. Faint vibrations told him riders were still coming, but hadn't split to search the side paths. Miss Alder's voice was a low rasp when she asked if they would follow far. He told her yes, if the sheriff rode for coin instead of justice, and Crowley was a man who didn't forget debts. She asked if he knew why they called her Indian's wife, and his eyes cut to hers in silence until she sighed and said the child had a right to know her father, something the town could never forgive. The girl listened without understanding all the words but clung tighter when Alder's arms shifted. Luta wanted to ask how long she had kept the moccasins hidden, How many nights she had prayed over them without speaking his name. But the sound of hooves below forced the words back. He took the lead rope and guided the sorrel into a narrow arroyo where the earth swallowed their tracks, then pushed them along until the walls rose and the sky was just a ribbon. The hawk's cry echoed strangely in the stone throat of the arroyo, like a warning layered over its own voice. Luta glanced upward and saw a wisp of dust drifting down from the rim, scouts already above them. He drew them into a shallow cave cut into the arroyo wall, no deeper than 3 men's length, and told them to stay still. The girl's small fingers found the fringe of his sleeve, holding there without sound. Hoofbeats passed overhead, muted by sand, but a stone clattered from above and rolled to the cave's mouth. Luta's hand brushed the hilt of his knife again, and his eyes followed the hawk's shadow as it crossed the opening. When the sound of pursuit faded, he stepped out, scanned the ridgeline, and saw only the wind moving through the brush. But the quiet felt too heavy, the kind that carried something waiting. He returned to them, lifted the girl back into the saddle, and told Miss Alder they would ride through the night if they had to. The sun was already burning toward the far hills, and the land ahead would offer either a way out or the place they'd be trapped forever. The arroyo spat them out onto a stretch of high ground where the wind carried ash like drifting snow, each flake a ghost from the burning they had left behind. The sorrel's stride slowed on the incline, its hide damp with the effort of carrying 3, and Luta swung down to walk beside it, scanning the horizon. Far to the west, a thin column of smoke still rose, a finger pointing back to the square, while to the east, the hills rolled in shadow toward country where no badge had weight. Miss Alder's face was pale, but her eyes stayed fixed ahead, her jaw locked against the pain in her wrists. The girl leaned against her, silent now, clutching one moccasin in her small hand as if afraid it might vanish. Luta read the land like a ledger. The rock spines, the wind-scoured draws, the scatter of fresh hoofprints in a low wash that told him they weren't the only ones headed east. The hawk wheeled above, dropping lower each time, its path too deliberate for chance. He wondered if the bird was hunting or watching. They reached a break in the ridge where an old fire had blackened the mesquite, leaving brittle branches like bones. And here Luta found what he feared. Tracks leading south, narrow enough to belong to scouts. He brushed the prints with his fingers, feeling the crumble of the earth, and said they were no more than an hour old. Miss Alder asked if they could turn north instead, but Luta shook his head. North meant waterless plains, and with a child, the sun would kill them before any rifle could. He led them into a shallow canyon where the walls still bore the soot marks of some long-ago blaze. The girl's eyes darted to the black streaks, as if they whispered something only she could hear. They camped in the lee of a rock face just long enough to drink. Luta broke hardtack into pieces small enough for the child to swallow, though she pushed half toward him without a word. He noticed her bare feet and bent to tie strips of cloth around them. The moccasin kept hidden beneath her mother's skirt. When the wind shifted, it brought the sound of iron, bits and spurs jangling on the move. He motioned for silence, pressing them into the shadow of the rock, and within moments, 2 riders crossed the ridge above, silhouetted against the dying sun. One paused, scanning the valley, and the hawk's cry cut the air again. The rider lifted a hand, pointing east, and the pair moved on, their horses picking a careful way down the far slope. Luta waited until the sound faded, then turned back to the sorrel, lifting the girl into the saddle first, then Miss Alder. He told them they would ride until the stars were sharp, and if they were lucky, the night would hide them from more than just the men they fled. The trail ahead dipped into a wash lined with cottonwoods, their leaves whispering in the rising wind, and Luta felt the weight of every mile pressing down on him. Somewhere in the dark ahead, he would need to choose between the longer road that might keep them hidden and the shorter path that would cut straight through land claimed by men who hated his people more than they feared the sheriff. The hawk flew on before them, its shadow long on the ground, and he wondered if it was leading them toward safety, or into a place they could never leave. The cottonwoods thinned until the wash gave way to a flat of pale dust and scattered rocks, the moon rising over it like a cold coin. Luta stopped the sorrel at the edge, his eyes sweeping the emptiness ahead. The shorter trail cut east-southeast, across ground claimed by the Rawlins gang, men who took tolls in flesh and blood, but it would save them a day's ride. Behind them, somewhere past the ridgeline, a faint glow still marked campfires, pursuit slow but steady. Miss Alder leaned forward, her voice low, saying they couldn't keep the child on the saddle all night without breaking her, and Luta nodded, though his gaze stayed locked on the horizon. The girl stirred at the sound of a wolf's howl, not far, and pressed closer to her mother. Luta remembered the old stories, wolves that walked beside warriors in the dark, leading them to water or away from ambush, and found himself listening for it again. When it came, it was closer to their right, and the sorrel flicked its ears but didn't shy. He took it as a sign and turned them toward the sound, into the path of the moonlight. The land here was open, no cover but waist-high sage, and each hoof-step sounded too loud. The hawk that had shadowed them earlier was gone, replaced by that distant, steady howl. An hour into the crossing, Luta saw movement near a cluster of low rocks, 2 mounted men, their outlines cutting against the stars. Rawlins' scouts. He slowed the sorrel, shifting to the far side of the sage, but one rider's head turned toward them, catching the pale flash of Miss Alder's dress. A sharp whistle carried over the open ground, answered by a shout farther east. Luta didn't wait. He dug his heels in, and the sorrel lunged forward, the girl holding tight as wind tore at her hair. Hoofbeats followed, gaining in bursts whenever the ground smoothed. Miss Alder clutched the child, her face set in silent determination, and Luta counted the seconds between shouts, marking how many were behind them now. Ahead, the howl rose again, this time from somewhere just beyond a shadowed dip in the ground. Without warning, the sorrel plunged into it, a dry creek bed, its banks steep but passable, and Luta swung them left, letting the earth hide them from the riders above. The wolf was there, standing in the moonlight at the far bank, amber eyes fixed on them. It didn't move until they reached the rise, then trotted ahead, keeping just within sight. Behind them, the gang's horses clattered along the creek's rim, voices angry at losing the trail. Luta followed the wolf deeper into the cut until it spilled them into a narrow ravine lined with black rock. The air here was cooler, damp with the promise of water, and the sound of the riders faded to nothing. The wolf stopped at a pool where moonlight touched the surface, then vanished into the brush without a sound. Miss Alder stared at the water as if she'd found a miracle, and the girl dipped her fingers in, smiling for the first time since they'd fled. Luta didn't speak of the risk they'd taken. Choosing the short way had worked this once, but every step now would carry them closer to men who would kill for the sport of it. He only said they would ride again before dawn, and that the wolf had bought them a few hours they couldn't waste. The first blush of dawn found them leaving the ravine, the air heavy with that strange stillness that comes after danger passes but before safety is earned. The sorrel's hooves thudded softly in the damp sand as they climbed a narrow slope toward a plateau, each step pulling them farther from the sound of pursuit. Luta kept glancing over his shoulder, but the horizon behind was empty, just a pale smear of smoke from the Rawlins campfires, too far to matter yet. Miss Alder's shoulders sagged from exhaustion, but she never loosened her grip on the girl, who had finally fallen into a restless sleep. The moccasin peeked from beneath the child's wrap, the beads catching the early light in brief sparks. As they reached the top, the land spread out into a flat plain broken by scattered boulders, the kind of place sound could vanish without a trace. Even the wind seemed to hesitate here, and Luta felt the weight of it pressing on his chest. He knew this place from years past, a stretch the Lakota called the ground of forgotten voices, where the dead were said to linger until their names were spoken. The hawk had returned, circling once before gliding east, but Luta kept them moving north, skirting a cluster of stones carved with old markings. Miss Alder asked what they meant, and he told her they were warnings, though whether of spirits or men he wouldn't say. Halfway across the plain, the wolf appeared again, loping along the edge of sight, head low as if tracking something only it could smell. The sorrel's ears pricked forward, sensing it before the humans did. Luta felt a prickle at the base of his neck, the kind he trusted, and stopped them beside a high rock. The silence broke, first with the faint ring of metal, then with the crack of a rifle from somewhere ahead. The bullet smacked into the rock just above Miss Alder's shoulder, showering her with grit. Luta shoved the sorrel behind cover, scanning the boulders for movement, but the shooter had already shifted, using the stillness to mask their position. He handed Miss Alder his knife, and told her if the worst came, she was to take the girl and run toward the wolf. Her eyes widened, but she nodded, clutching the blade tight. Another shot rang out, this one aimed at the horse, and Luta darted from cover, using the flat of the rock as a shield to close the distance toward where the flash had come. He moved like shadow, years of hunting and being hunted making his steps sure. The hawk screamed overhead, drawing his eye to a ridge where a lone figure crouched, face hidden under a scarf, rifle steady. Luta loosed a stone from his sling, striking the barrel hard enough to jar the shot wide, then was on them before they could recover. The fight was short, the stranger retreating into the rocks with a curse in a language Luta didn't know. When he returned to the sorrel, the wolf was gone again, but its paw prints led east, the same direction the hawk had taken. Luta said nothing, only helped Miss Alder back into the saddle, and took the reins. The ground of forgotten voices lay silent behind them, but he knew that silence could follow if they lingered too long. Ahead, the land sloped into a valley cut with silver water, a place where tracks might vanish, if they reached it before the riders found their trail again. They descended into the valley just as the sun crested the eastern ridge, pouring gold over the silver thread of water that wound through the grass, the sorrel picking its way down carefully over loose shale, while Luta's hand stayed steady on the reins, the air scented with sage and damp earth after days of dry dust. Miss Alder easing the sleeping child against her shoulder and whispering something the wind carried away as Luta's eyes swept constantly for riders, dust trails, or moving shadows. The valley floor soft and perfect for hiding tracks, so he guided them straight into the shallow stream, letting the current carry away scent and ripples mask their passage, while the hawk circled above before gliding downstream, a movement in the reeds revealing the wolf knee-deep in the shallows, staring at him before padding ahead, as Miss Alder asked if it meant to guide them, and Luta simply replied, "Some things need no questioning." Half an hour later, finding a willow-covered island, where he dismounted to lead them through a denser channel, the girl stirring at the snap of twigs until soothed by her mother. The far bank churned with elk tracks that he followed through tall meadow grass brushing their knees, the wolf stopping near a hollowed cottonwood and watching them as Miss Alder's face showed the first hint of hope. But Luta remained cautious when the faint smell of wood smoke drifted on the air, slowing to listen and hearing only water and willow leaves until the hawk screeched once and wheeled west, pressing on toward a narrow cut between ridges where fresh, small hoofprints marked the trail. Not riders, but ponies, his jaw tightening as he chose the right-hand path where the stream vanished underground. The cooler air and absence of the wolf sharpening Miss Alder's whispered question about danger, which he did not answer, moving into the shadow where the rock walls closed in until at the far end of the cut he saw a thin curl of smoke, and the silhouette of a man waiting with a rifle resting casually across his knees. The man by the fire didn't move as Luta slowed the sorrel, the horse's breath hanging white in the cool shadow of the pass, his face weathered and lined like carved oak under the brim of a battered hat, eyes following them with a calm that spoke of either deep trust or the quiet readiness to kill. The rifle lying across his knees, well kept but idle, and Miss Alder tightening her hold on the girl as she whispered if he was friend or foe. Luta giving no answer while stepping forward alone until the smell of coffee and curing meat from the fire met him. The stranger's slow mountain drawl breaking the stillness as he said he'd been watching since the ridge and that they carried a trail of hornets behind them, denying they were his hornets, but making it plain that trouble wasn't welcome in his stretch without a reason. The wolf slipping from the shadows to settle near the flames with an unreadable gaze, Miss Alder murmuring it had followed them for miles, while the man, unfazed, gestured toward water and a pile of split wood, and Luta, measuring the risk, nodding and leading the horse closer while keeping himself between her and the stranger, Miss Alder accepting the offered coffee with trembling hands as they rested in tense silence, until the man's eyes lingered on the beaded moccasin beneath the blanket, and he asked about kin in the north. Her answer a careful no, his grunt carrying disbelief, then speaking of a hidden path out of the pass too steep for most but safe from Rawlins, though it led into country without white law, a detail he left hanging as they rose to leave. The man finally standing tall despite age, resting a hand on the wolf's head and telling Luta that the animal had been leading him true and might keep doing so if given no reason to stop, before returning to his fire as if they'd never been there, and Luta guiding them into the narrow side path while the wolf's shadow flitted ahead, the faint echo of hooves behind reminding them the pass would not stay empty for long. The side path was little more than a ledge chiseled into the mountainside, the sorrel's hooves scraping rock that fell away into empty air, while Luta kept one steady hand on the reins and the other near his rifle. The wolf pacing ahead with a sure-footed ease that made the treacherous way seem deliberate, Miss Alder leaning forward over the child to shield her from the sharp wind that knifed down from the snow line, her knuckles white where they clung to the saddle horn, as dust and grit slipped away under each step. Behind them, the faint drum of hooves swelled and faded, echoing strangely in the gulch, until a sharper crack. A rifle split the air, the shot striking rock close enough to sting Luta's cheek with stone splinters, the echo rolling away like thunder as he urged the sorrel faster despite the narrow track. Around a bend the path steepened, twisting between jagged spires, and there the wolf paused, looking back with an almost human insistence before slipping into a cleft in the rock, Luta following to find a hidden shelf wide enough for the horse and sheltered by leaning pines. He drew Miss Alder down, ordering her to keep the child low as he scanned the valley below, catching a glint of sun on metal far off. Too far for a clean shot, but close enough to mean pursuit would not end soon. The wolf trotted ahead again, leading them through a winding maze of stone that opened suddenly into a high meadow dotted with early wildflowers and a spring-fed pool where the sorrel drank deeply, steam curling from its muzzle. Miss Alder's voice was quiet but certain when she said the place felt wrong in its stillness, and Luta agreed, pointing to the far end where a cluster of stacked stones marked an old camp, the ashes within still faintly warm. He knelt, pressing his palm to the heat, then looked up sharply as the hawk screamed overhead, a warning, and the wolf bristled, growling toward the timberline. He knew they had minutes, maybe less, before Rawlins's men found the cut, so he swung Miss Alder back onto the sorrel, tying the child securely against her, then turned them toward the last climb. A narrow switchback carved into the cliff face, each step taking them higher into air so thin it burned the lungs, the meadow vanishing below until the only sound was the wind and the distant, closing thunder of hooves. The switchback clung to the cliff like a thread, each turn pulling them higher until the valley was only a smear of green and gold far below. The wind tearing at their clothes as Luta urged the sorrel upward, Miss Alder clutching the child tight, her face pale but set against the bite of the thin air. The shouts of pursuit rose and fell behind them, echoing up the stone, the wolf's gray shape keeping just ahead while the hawk circled high, its shadow sweeping over the trail like a silent warning. The path ended abruptly at a rock wall, but Luta found a narrow crack hidden in shadow, just wide enough for the sorrel to squeeze through, leading them into a small hidden plateau, ringed by cliffs, soft with grass, and fed by a cold spring bubbling from beneath the stone. Miss Alder sagged in the saddle, whispering they might have lost them, but Luta's eyes stayed fixed on the gap they'd entered, and a heartbeat later the clink of dislodged stone proved him right as Rawlins appeared, hat gone, eyes blazing, rifle in hand. Before he could aim, the hawk screamed and dove, talons raking at his face, throwing him back into the man behind him, boots slipping on the ledge. Luta lunged forward, driving the rifle butt into Rawlins's chest, sending both men tumbling out of sight, their curses fading down the cliff. The wolf bristled, then slowly eased, padding back to Miss Alder's side, and the hawk wheeled upward again to perch above the spring. Luta checked the gap once more, then let the sorrel drink, the thin mountain air smelling of pine and snow, the place untouched, as if it had been waiting for them. Miss Alder met his gaze, neither speaking of danger or the road ahead, only knowing they had reached ground where the wind carried no scent of gunpowder, and the earth bore no fresh tracks, the hawk stretching its wings to the sun, while the mountain kept their secrets.